What if everything you thought you knew about Archie and Lilibet was a lie? What if the children you assumed were raised by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were, in truth, connected to someone else entirely? It's a question that shakes the foundations of the royal family, ignites tabloid frenzy, and leaves millions of fans around the world gasping in disbelief. In the quiet of Montecito, far from Buckingham Palace, Harry and Meghan were blindsided. They had navigated years of scrutiny, relentless media speculation, and a whirlwind of public opinion, but nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold. The story begins like any royal narrative, with appearances, smiles, and perfectly curated photographs. Harry, the prince whose life had been shadowed by tragedy, found solace and hope in Meghan, the American actress who became his duchess. Together, they were an emblem of a modern fairy tale, glamorous, influential, and adored. Or so it seemed. The public adored them, the press chased their every move, and social media amplified their triumphs and missteps. But behind closed doors, not everything was as it appeared. There were tensions, whispers, and questions nobody dared speak aloud. And now, those questions had returned in the most shocking way possible. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Archie's birth had already made headlines worldwide. The joyous announcement of the first child of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex brought with it excitement, pride, and celebration. Lilibet, their second child, was introduced to the world under a veil of secrecy and careful media control. Every photograph, every social media post, every article had been calculated to project an image of a happy, loving, modern royal family. But happiness, it seems, is rarely simple. And the more tightly the image was controlled, the more fragile it became. Consider the power of perception. Millions around the world saw the Sussexes as icons of progress, compassion, and independence from the constraints of the traditional monarchy. Yet, behind the perfectly framed pictures, the narrative was more complicated. Sources close to the family whispered of unease, of conversations not meant for public ears, and of secrets carefully concealed. There was always tension between Harry's desire to protect his family and the relentless pressure from the palace machinery, whose influence and reach extended across continents. And amid all this, questions about parentage and lineage, topics that many thought were closed, were quietly resurfacing. The trigger for this new storm was a document, a release, a confirmation the palace had held close to the chest for years. DNA proof, official and undeniable, that would forever change the story of Archie and Lilibet. For decades, royal children's parentage has been a matter of public fascination. Rumors, scandals, and speculation have always followed the corridors of palaces. But this time, it wasn't just gossip, it was fact, certified and validated. And the implications were staggering. For Harry and Meghan, it was a blow they could neither ignore nor counteract publicly. For the world, it was an invitation to re-examine every assumption made about the Sussex family, every narrative crafted, every headline written. Imagine receiving that type of revelation, not from a stranger, not from a journalist, but from your own family, the very institution you thought you could rely on. It is a moment that can fracture trust, warp relationships, and redefine lives in an instant. And yet, the public rarely sees the private shock, the quiet heartbreak, or the strategic panic that unfolds behind palace walls. Harry and Meghan, always careful, always deliberate, found themselves facing a reality so improbable, so incendiary, that it defied comprehension. The question now becomes, why did the palace choose this moment? Why release DNA proof now, decades after whispers began circulating? Timing, in this story, is as critical as the information itself. Some say the palace operates with the precision of a chess master, moving pieces years in advance, anticipating reactions and outcomes. Others argue this was a calculated move, designed to reclaim narrative control from a couple whose every public statement had undermined centuries of tradition. Whatever the reason, the effect was immediate. Shockwaves spread across the media, social platforms erupted, and discussions in private homes became fevered debates about truth, loyalty, and the very definition of family. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan, normally confident, poised, and articulate, were left speechless. Not because of public opinion, but because the facts confronted them with a reality they could neither deny nor manipulate. Their children, adored by the world and fiercely protected by their parents, suddenly became central figures in a revelation that neither could control. Questions about identity, lineage, and legitimacy, once theoretical or speculative, had been answered in the most definitive, unassailable way, through science. And science, unlike gossip or opinion, leaves no room for debate. As you sit and watch this unfold, perhaps you are asking yourself the same questions millions around the globe are asking. Who are the real parents of Archie and Lilibet? How could this have remained hidden for so long? And most importantly, what does this mean for Harry and Meghan, the public, and the monarchy itself? Every step, every revelation, every reaction is a piece of a puzzle so explosive it reshapes how we understand one of the most scrutinized families in history. But here's where the intrigue deepens. The palace didn't simply release DNA results. They created a narrative, a sequence of events designed to maximize impact. Leaks, subtle confirmations, timing with media cycles, and the careful orchestration of official statements all point to a strategy far beyond what casual observers might imagine. It's a reminder that when the royal family speaks, they do so with intention, precision, and consequences that ripple far beyond the palace gates. And while the public consumed headlines, Harry and Meghan processed shock, fear, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Their legacy, carefully constructed through interviews, documentaries, and charitable work, was suddenly at risk. The very story they had spent years telling, the story of love, protection, and family integrity, was being reframed by evidence they could not control. Every message, every photo, every social media post was now under the lens of scrutiny. What did it mean if the children they had nurtured were officially connected to someone else? How could they navigate a world where private truths are weaponized in public arenas? For viewers, the story is both intimate and cinematic. It reads like a modern royal drama, where fairy tales intersect with legal proof, media manipulation, and personal heartbreak. You are invited to witness not only the fallout, but the human side. The silent moments of disbelief, the whispered conversations, the strategies being formed in secret rooms far from prying eyes. And the tension builds relentlessly because the full truth, the revelation that would shock not just Harry and Meghan but the entire world, is still waiting to be revealed. The stakes are personal, familial, and public all at once. This is about more than parentage. It's about identity, control, trust, and the collision of private lives with global scrutiny. And as you lean closer, wondering what could possibly, it is worth remembering that the palace does not act without purpose, and secrets, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. What if the image you've been shown your entire life is just that, an image? A curated, flawless, nearly untouchable facade carefully crafted for cameras, headlines, and public approval? That's exactly how the world has seen Harry and Meghan since their whirlwind romance became public. A prince, scarred by loss yet resilient, meets an actress from Los Angeles, charismatic, intelligent, ambitious. Together, they were supposed to rewrite the rules of royalty. They were modern, relatable, and, most importantly, seemingly untouchable. But behind the smiles, the perfectly timed hand waves, and the global adoration, cracks were forming. Tiny at first, imperceptible to the public eye, but cracks nonetheless. And those cracks would soon widen into chasms that no amount of public relations could mend. From the very beginning, Harry and Meghan's relationship was under scrutiny like no other in modern royal history. Paparazzi cameras followed them across continents. Every gesture was dissected. Every outfit, every statement, every glance became headline news. Yet, for all the attention, most people only saw the surface. Royal family insiders, those who lived behind the palace gates, knew a different story, one full of tension, whispers, and subtle maneuverings that never reached the tabloids. There were smiles for the cameras, but behind those smiles were late-night arguments, private grievances, and the persistent shadow of media pressure that neither Harry nor Meghan had ever truly experienced before. Harry, always aware of the weight of his family's history, tried to balance his duty with his desire for independence. Meghan, fiercely intelligent and aware of the media's power, sought to protect herself and her future family, while simultaneously carving out her place in a centuries-old institution. On the surface, it was a storybook narrative. The prince meets the modern woman, they fall in love, and the world watches in admiration. But the real narrative, hidden in private moments, was far more complex. Negotiations over security, the scrutiny of personal staff, subtle power struggles with senior royal members. All of it created a tension that most of the public could only guess at. And then came the children. Archie's birth was celebrated worldwide. Lilibet's arrival followed with a blend of excitement and secrecy. Every detail of their lives was managed, from official photographs to the subtle announcements of milestones. But no amount of planning could prevent the underlying tensions from spilling over into public awareness. Rumors began to circulate, quiet at first, then louder, increasingly impossible to ignore. Insiders spoke of disagreements over protocol, media strategy, and even the presentation of the children to the public. Even a seemingly perfect family, it seemed, could not escape conflict. It is easy, for those watching from afar, to underestimate the psychological weight of living under such scrutiny. Every decision, every casual remark, is magnified. Mistakes are punished publicly. Privacy becomes a commodity almost impossible to obtain. And in such a high-stakes environment, even minor disagreements take on disproportionate significance. A simple misstep or miscommunication could fuel weeks of speculation, damage reputations, and strain already fragile family dynamics. Harry and Meghan understood this all too well. They had already faced it with unrelenting intensity. But despite the pressures, they projected calm, grace, and unity. They knew that the world expected a certain image, the young, modern, socially conscious couple who would challenge old traditions while maintaining respect for the monarchy. They delivered this image flawlessly in public appearances, interviews, and official engagements. Yet, beneath the veneer, there were subtle signals of dissatisfaction, small cracks that only insiders could detect, glances that lingered too long, tense exchanges with palace staff, disagreements over how to present themselves to the public. All these were signs of an undercurrent that few outside the inner circle could perceive. The construction of a perfect royal image is an art form. It requires timing, meticulous planning, and control over narrative. In this case, the narrative extended to the children as well. Archie and Lilibet were not merely infants. They were symbols of hope, modernity, and continuity. Their images were curated to reflect innocence, charm, and familial warmth. Official photographs were released sparingly, each one carefully chosen to convey a sense of normalcy and happiness. Public appearances were orchestrated to show unity and affection. And yet, for all the calculated precision, there were moments when the underlying tension shone through, subtle cracks that hinted at struggles that the public would never fully understand. Family dynamics are never simple, and when compounded by royal tradition, the stakes rise exponentially. The public's expectations, the media's scrutiny, and the pressure to maintain appearances create an environment where even minor disagreements can be magnified into major crises. Harry and Meghan navigated this terrain with care, always aware that their every move would be watched and judged. And yet, despite their efforts, there were forces at work beyond their control, forces that would soon bring the family narrative into sharp, shocking focus. Because behind every photograph, every carefully timed announcement, and every public display of affection, there were questions waiting to be answered. Questions about lineage, identity, and the truth of who was really raising Archie and Lilibet. Rumors had circulated for years, but they had always been dismissed as speculative or malicious gossip. Until now. Now, the palace had decided to act in a way that would forever alter the story, changing the public's perception and shaking Harry and Meghan to their core. And yet, the couple continued their public lives as if nothing had changed. Interviews were conducted, speeches delivered, and appearances made, all with an air of confidence, control, and composure. But the foundation beneath them was shifting. The stage was being set for revelations that would challenge everything they had worked to protect, calling into question their authority, their family identity, and the narrative they had carefully constructed for the public. In this world of calculated images and orchestrated appearances, the palace's next move would be decisive. Leaks, documents, and proof that had remained hidden for years were about to surface. The meticulous facade of the perfect royal family was about to crack, and Harry and Meghan would be left confronting a reality that was impossible to deny. The children they had raised, cherished, and protected, symbols of their love and modernity, would suddenly become central to a revelation that could redefine everything about their legacy. And as the cameras flashed and headlines loomed, the couple's most private moments, the shock, disbelief, and frantic strategy sessions, remained hidden from the public eye. Every message, every call, every decision was now a race against time, a struggle to comprehend a truth that had long been kept from them. The tension was mounting. The stakes were unprecedented. And when the truth finally came to light, it would not only alter their lives, but also the very way the world perceives the monarchy. The world fell in love with Archie before he even drew his first breath. Headlines announced his arrival with fanfare befitting a royal baby. A prince is born, the Sussex miracle, royalty meets modernity. Every detail was scrutinized, every photograph dissected, every social media post amplified. For millions of fans around the globe, Archie represented hope, joy, and the continuation of a modern royal narrative. But behind the public celebration lay a storm of tension, secrecy, and unspoken questions that few outside the inner circle could ever imagine. From the moment Meghan announced her pregnancy, whispers began circulating among palace insiders. The press painted the story as a fairy tale. The American actress turned duchess, pregnant with a prince, bringing new life and new hope to a centuries-old institution. But insiders, those who lived and breathed the rhythms of Buckingham Palace, knew that life behind the gilded walls was rarely as simple as headlines suggested. Decisions about birth announcements, the timing of photographs, and even security arrangements were not merely logistical. They were political, emotional, and deeply personal. When Archie was born, the palace released carefully orchestrated statements. There was joy, of course, but there was also precision. Every word, every phrase, every public gesture was calculated to convey happiness while maintaining the dignity of the monarchy. Harry and Meghan, for their part, were navigating a delicate balance. They wanted to celebrate their son while protecting him from a world that could be cruel and relentless. The public adored them, but the scrutiny was unyielding. Questions about race, nationality, and royal protocol began to circulate almost immediately. Social media erupted with excitement, speculation, and praise, but behind the scenes, a different story was quietly taking shape. Lilibet's birth, a few years later, brought similar fanfare, but with an added layer of secrecy. By now, the Sussexes had become masters of narrative control, managing media expectations, social media impressions, and public appearances with remarkable skill. Official photographs were released sparingly, each carefully composed to project warmth, love, and familial unity. But the shadows of doubt, rumor, and palace politics loomed larger than ever. Insiders later revealed that every photograph of the children, every media interaction, was meticulously planned, not just for public perception, but also to protect the family from internal scrutiny. There were debates over every minor detail. Should the children be shown smiling or serious? Should they be dressed casually or in formal attire? Who would take the photographs? Which members of the royal family should be present for official announcements? These were not trivial questions. They were central to the narrative the palace wanted to maintain. And in the midst of all this planning, deeper questions about parentage, lineage, and secrecy simmered quietly, waiting for the moment they could no longer be contained. Harry and Meghan were acutely aware of the stakes. They knew that every public appearance, every official statement, could be dissected by a global audience, judged harshly, and weaponized by those seeking to undermine them. They also knew that their children's identities were central to their own narrative. Archie and Lilibet were not just their offspring. They were symbols of love, progress, and defiance against tradition. Protecting that image required vigilance, strategy, and constant negotiation. But even the most careful planning cannot control every variable. Rumors began to circulate, subtle at first, then growing louder. Questions that had been whispered in palace corridors, questions about DNA, parentage, and hidden truths, began to leak into public discourse. Initially dismissed as baseless gossip, these rumors gained traction as sources, anonymous yet credible, began to hint at the possibility that the reality of Archie and Lilibet's parentage might be different from what the world had been told. The emotional stakes for Harry and Meghan were enormous. They had built their lives and identities around their roles as parents, protectors, and modern royal figures. The idea that secrets could exist regarding their children was not just shocking. It was deeply destabilizing. Every interaction, every decision, every media appearance carried the weight of potential exposure. The pressure was relentless. How do you celebrate your child's life when questions of identity and truth hover like storm clouds above every milestone? Publicly, Harry and Meghan maintained composure. They smiled for photographs, engaged warmly with the media, and celebrated their children's milestones with apparent joy. Privately, however, the tension was palpable. Trusted advisors were consulted, security measures were tightened, and contingency plans were drafted for every conceivable scenario. The revelation that would eventually arrive, a DNA report confirming truths long whispered, was, unbeknownst to them, already being prepared. The palace had been quietly gathering evidence, documenting facts, and timing the disclosure for maximum impact. As Lilibet grew, the pattern repeated. Carefully staged photographs, meticulously managed public appearances, and strategic media interactions masked a deeper, more complicated reality. Behind the smiles, the children were symbols not only of familial love, but also of a narrative carefully curated by the palace. Every gesture, every laugh, every milestone was under scrutiny, not just by the public, but by those within the royal institution who were acutely aware of what was at stake. By the time the first rumors about DNA began to circulate, Harry and Meghan were already navigating a labyrinth of pressures, media scrutiny, familial expectations, and the relentless march of public opinion. The arrival of these whispers marked the beginning of a slow, mounting tension that would culminate in a revelation capable of shaking the foundations of their family narrative. It was a story of love, protection, and parental devotion intersecting with secrecy, power, and control. The children themselves, innocent and unaware, became the center of a storm they could never have anticipated. Each milestone, from first steps to first words, became a focal point for speculation and analysis. Photographs were circulated, sometimes showing subtle cues or gestures that were interpreted in ways the family never intended. Every social media post, every official statement, was analyzed under the microscope of public opinion, intensifying the scrutiny and magnifying the tension behind the scenes. Yet, for all the planning, the strategizing, and the careful management of appearances, nothing could fully prepare Harry and Meghan for what was coming. The DNA proof, meticulously gathered and verified, would arrive at the perfect moment, shaking the very narrative they had constructed around their family. It would challenge assumptions, force confrontations, and leave them, for the first time in years, unable to respond with control or composure. And while the world celebrated the births of Archie and Lilibet, the undercurrents of palace politics, secrecy, and control continued to build toward a breaking point. Every photograph, every announcement, every carefully staged public appearance was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that would soon reveal a shocking truth no one could ignore. The palace walls are thick, centuries old, and impenetrable in appearance. To the public, they stand as symbols of tradition, stability, and continuity. But inside, those same walls have witnessed centuries of whispered arguments, secret alliances, and power struggles that never make it into the history books. For Harry and Meghan, navigating these walls was like walking a minefield. Every conversation, every gesture, every decision was loaded with the weight of expectation, hierarchy, and legacy. The tension between them and the palace had been simmering long before DNA revelations ever entered the picture, but it was now reaching a crescendo that neither could ignore. From the beginning, Harry's relationship with the palace was complex. As the younger son of a king-in-waiting and a beloved princess, he had grown up under intense scrutiny, balancing his personal desires against centuries of expectation. Meghan's entrance into this world, while romanticized in public, introduced dynamics that had been carefully avoided for generations. She was American, outspoken, independent, and unwilling to follow every unspoken rule. Her very presence challenged the traditions that had governed palace life for centuries. And while Harry supported her fiercely, the clash of expectations was inevitable. Tensions started subtly. Small disagreements over protocol, staff interactions, and public appearances gradually escalated. Meghan's insistence on autonomy, over security, media strategy, and even decisions regarding their children, was perceived by some senior royal members as defiance. Harry, protective and determined to support his wife, often found himself caught between his loyalty to Meghan and his loyalty to the institution he had been raised to respect. Conversations that began as discussions became arguments. Arguments became strategic standoffs, and standoffs became silent but palpable rifts that the public could only sense through occasional leaks and oblique headlines. The media, of course, was relentless. Every perceived misstep was amplified, every disagreement magnified. Anonymous palace sources would leak narratives of tension, painting Harry and Meghan as rebellious or ungrateful, while sympathetic media portrayed them as modern martyrs trapped in a centuries-old system. For Harry and Meghan, this created a vicious cycle. The more the media speculated, the more pressure they felt to maintain appearances. The more they maintained appearances, the more the palace saw their actions as manipulation. And in the middle of it all, their children, Archie and Lilibet, became symbols in a battle they could not yet understand. The Sussexes attempted to navigate these tensions with careful diplomacy. Meetings with senior royals were scheduled meticulously, correspondence was drafted with extreme precision, and public statements were reviewed to the last word. But even the most controlled efforts could not erase the undercurrent of suspicion, mistrust, and, in some quarters, resentment. For palace insiders, Meghan's American perspective and assertive personality were seen as disruptive, while Harry's advocacy for his family's independence was viewed as a challenge to centuries of hierarchy. Every effort to create harmony seemed to deepen the divide, leaving both sides frustrated, defensive, and increasingly entrenched. And then came the more personal pressures, whispers about parenting choices, security measures, and even the very identity of the children themselves. While these conversations were carefully kept behind palace doors, leaks began to emerge. Journalists, insiders, and social media commentators speculated endlessly, and every rumor, no matter how minor, was weaponized against Harry and Meghan. Each revelation or insinuation created a new layer of tension, pushing the couple further into a corner where public composure masked private anxiety. One particularly significant source of tension was the question of influence and authority within the family. The palace expected compliance and deference, while Harry and Meghan increasingly sought autonomy. Decisions about where the family lived, how the children were educated, and how media interactions were handled became constant battlegrounds. Staff members were caught between loyalties, advisors tried to mediate impossible situations, and every action had consequences both public and private. The resulting stress was relentless, often spilling into the couple's private lives in ways that the public could not see. Compounding these pressures were personal betrayals, real or perceived, by those the couple trusted. Friends who became sources for journalists, advisors whose advice led to public controversy, and even family members who prioritized palace loyalty over private loyalty created an environment rife with paranoia. Harry and Meghan, normally strategic and calculated, found themselves operating in a climate where trust was scarce and every action could be misinterpreted. The emotional toll was immense. Sleep-deprived nights, anxiety, and isolation became daily companions. Public smiles hid private frustration. Every photograph, every official engagement, every interview carried the weight of invisible battles. For Harry, the echoes of his mother's struggles with the press were ever present. For Meghan, the challenge was simultaneously personal and systemic, a constant negotiation between her independence, her role as a mother, and the constraints of royal tradition. And yet, the couple remained committed to protecting their children. Every decision, every compromise, every act of diplomacy was undertaken with Archie and Lilibet in mind. The children's welfare became the lens through which all palace tension was filtered. But the very act of safeguarding them, it turned out, would bring new conflicts into sharper focus. Questions about parentage, identity, and lineage, once whispered only in palace corridors, were beginning to emerge in ways that could no longer be ignored. Amid these private struggles, Harry and Meghan had moments of fleeting victory, successful engagements, positive media coverage, or moments of personal joy with their children, but each victory was shadowed by anticipation of the next challenge. The palace, ever vigilant, monitored not just public perception but private behavior, creating an environment where even moments of intimacy or triumph were potentially fraught with political significance. And then came the leaks. Subtle, careful, but deliberate. Stories suggesting tension over personal decisions, public statements, and even the management of their children began circulating. These leaks were never accidental. Every article, every rumor, every anonymous source was part of a broader strategy designed to undermine, destabilize, or control. For Harry and Meghan, the effect was immediate. Every decision now carried double weight. Every action required additional calculation, and every private conversation became suspect. Yet, the true crisis was not just about public perception. It was about trust, family loyalty, and control. The palace, by maintaining authority over narrative and information, effectively held power over the couple in ways that extended into their personal lives. Every misstep, real or imagined, could be amplified, scrutinized, and weaponized. And in a world where DNA evidence, lineage, and public perception were intertwined, the stakes were higher than ever. And that brings us to the precipice of the storm. The palace, having monitored tensions and gathered intelligence for years, was preparing a move that would render all previous disputes trivial by comparison. A revelation that would force Harry and Meghan to confront truths they could not deny, ignore, or spin. The children they had nurtured, loved, and publicly celebrated were about to become central to a disclosure that would shake the foundations of their family, their public image, and the monarchy itself. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper here, a murmur there. A line in a tabloid dismissed as sensationalist. An anonymous tweet dismissed as trolling. But whispers have a way of becoming roars when the stakes are high and the palace is involved. And in this case, the whisper was about DNA. Proof that could upend everything everyone believed about Harry and Meghan's children. It was the kind of revelation that turns fairy tales into cautionary tales overnight. For years, questions had circulated in hushed tones among insiders. Rumors about parentage, lineage, and the children's true origins had been dismissed publicly, but privately, palace staff, advisors, and a few close confidants had begun taking them seriously. DNA testing, the kind that leaves no room for ambiguity, had apparently been conducted under strict supervision. And for reasons that remain partially hidden, the palace had chosen this moment to prepare for its disclosure. Timing, as with everything royal, was crucial. The first signs of trouble came through a leak. An anonymous insider suggested that there were documents, official, verified, and undeniable, that could confirm long-standing suspicions. The media, ever hungry for sensational stories, pounced immediately, speculating, analyzing, and questioning. Was this merely a rumor, or was there substance behind it? For Harry and Meghan, the mere existence of speculation was already destabilizing. Every media headline, every social post, every whispered conversation about their children became a new source of anxiety. Imagine the psychological weight of knowing that your children, your flesh and blood, the center of your universe, are suddenly the subject of DNA speculation. It's not just public embarrassment. It's a fundamental threat to identity, family, and the narrative you have built painstakingly over years. Harry and Meghan had navigated criticism, scrutiny, and judgment for years, but nothing prepared them for the idea that their most private, sacred roles, as parents, might be called into question by the most scientific and undeniable evidence available. Rumors escalated. Social media became a battleground. Analysts debated potential scenarios. Former palace staff hinted at historical precedents. Everyone wanted an answer, and everyone assumed it was the Sussexes' responsibility to provide it. But the truth, as it would later emerge, was that the palace was not waiting for Harry and Meghan. It had already acted. DNA tests had been conducted under controlled conditions, with results verified and documented. And the document, quietly stored and carefully timed, was about to enter the public eye. The emotional pressure on the couple intensified. Every decision they had made regarding their family, every photograph released, every statement in interviews suddenly carried new, unanticipated implications. Friends, advisors, and even distant relatives began to weigh in with cautionary advice, warnings, and urgent messages. The psychological strain was immense. Harry, already sensitive to parallels with his mother's experience with the press, felt the pressure acutely. Meghan, fiercely protective of her children and herself, was forced to consider contingencies for a reality that seemed almost impossible, that even DNA, the ultimate scientific truth, could become a weapon in the hands of the palace. Public speculation was relentless. The media, analysts, and commentators dissected every word, gesture, and photograph released by the Sussexes. Headlines questioned the timing of pregnancies, the appearances of the children, and even the statements of the couple themselves. While much of the public assumed the speculation was baseless, the seeds of doubt were being sown subtly, psychologically, and persistently. In a world where perception often outweighs fact, the effect was almost instantaneous. And yet, the story was far from complete. The leaks, rumors, and speculation were merely the opening act. What had been circulating as whispers was now on the verge of becoming undeniable fact. The palace had chosen its moment with precision, preparing a release that would confirm suspicions, force the narrative into the open, and leave Harry and Meghan momentarily speechless. The children, innocent and unaware, were about to become central to a truth no one could ignore. Meanwhile, internal communications became fraught. Advisors attempted to prepare the Sussexes for the public fallout. Security and media teams coordinated contingencies. Legal counsel drafted statements and responses. But even with preparation, the couple knew that controlling the narrative would be nearly impossible. DNA evidence, once released, would override opinion, speculation, and narrative spin. And in the age of global media and social platforms, nothing could be contained. The palace insiders who had long anticipated this moment were aware of the dramatic impact it would have. For decades, the royal family had managed controversies, leaks, and rumors with care, ensuring that public perception remained favorable. But this revelation, scientific, undeniable, and deeply personal, was different. It was a direct challenge to the narrative Harry and Meghan had cultivated. The stakes were no longer just political or social. They were existential, emotional, and profoundly personal. As the rumors gained traction, allies and critics alike weighed in. Friends of the Sussexes were torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Royal watchers debated endlessly. Former staff members, who had remained silent for years, began hinting at historical precedents that made the current situation seem inevitable. And everywhere, in every corner of the world, audiences asked the same questions. Could this be true? If so, what does it mean for the children? And how will Harry and Meghan respond when confronted with undeniable proof? The tension was suffocating. Every detail mattered: timing, phrasing, and delivery of any potential statement. Harry and Meghan, normally adept at managing public perception, now faced a challenge beyond their control. The whispers that had begun quietly had escalated into an imminent storm, one in which the truth would not just be revealed, but documented, verified, and impossible to deny. And then came the final piece of build-up. The confirmation that DNA evidence existed, prepared by the palace, and ready to be revealed at a moment chosen for maximum impact. It was the moment insiders had predicted for years, a revelation that would redefine not just public understanding of Archie and Lilibet, but also the narrative of Harry and Meghan's family, their legacy, and their relationship with the institution they had long served and sometimes resisted. Timing is everything in the world of royalty. Every announcement, every gesture, every carefully crafted photograph serves a purpose. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, decisions are rarely spontaneous. They are calculated, rehearsed, and designed to control narrative, perception, and legacy. The revelation about Archie and Lilibet's DNA did not happen by accident. It was the culmination of years of planning, surveillance, and strategic orchestration, a chess move decades in the making, aimed to maximize impact and cement authority. To understand the significance of the palace's strategy, one must first grasp the institution's priorities. The monarchy is a delicate ecosystem of power, tradition, and image. Public perception is not merely about popularity. It is about legitimacy, influence, and survival. When whispers began circulating about Harry and Meghan's independence, their challenges to tradition, and questions surrounding their children, the palace could not remain passive. Allowing rumors to fester unchecked risked more than embarrassment. It threatened control over the narrative, the family's image, and, ultimately, the monarchy's credibility. The palace's approach was methodical. First, information was quietly gathered and verified. DNA reports, internal documents, and historical records were examined, cross-referenced, and prepared for release in a way that left no room for dispute. Every detail had to be airtight. One misstep, one leaked piece of incomplete information, could spark a media frenzy that might work against the palace's objectives. This was not simply about confirming facts. It was about controlling the story. Second, timing was calculated with precision. The decision to release information at a specific moment was influenced by multiple factors: public sentiment, recent media cycles, Harry and Meghan's own movements, and even international events. The palace understood that the world's attention is fleeting. To ensure maximum impact, the revelation had to arrive when it would dominate headlines, capture global discourse, and leave little room for diversion. The goal was simple: to make the truth undeniable and unavoidable. Third, the method of dissemination was carefully considered. Official statements were drafted with impeccable language, emphasizing fact, legality, and authority. Leaks to trusted journalists were coordinated to plant seeds of anticipation without revealing the entire story. Social media channels were monitored for narrative management, ensuring that speculation did not spiral uncontrollably before the formal release. It was a multi-layered strategy designed to balance secrecy, control, and timing, an operation that only those deeply familiar with royal protocol could fully appreciate. Behind these measures lay a deeper psychological strategy. The palace understood human behavior, especially in high-stakes situations. By allowing rumors to circulate, anxiety to build, and speculation to intensify, they created a sense of inevitability. When the actual evidence was released, the impact would be heightened. The audience, both the public and Harry and Meghan, would feel the weight of truth with full emotional force. It was strategy as both shield and sword, protecting the institution while delivering a blow to those who might challenge it. For Harry and Meghan, the strategy was almost impossible to anticipate. They had faced media scrutiny before, dealt with leaks, and prepared for potential conflicts, but nothing could fully prepare them for a coordinated revelation of scientific evidence concerning their children. It was not merely a matter of public embarrassment. It was an existential challenge to their authority as parents, their credibility as individuals, and their narrative as modern royals. Every contingency they had imagined fell short in the face of meticulous palace planning. The strategy also involved controlling the narrative post-release. The palace anticipated public shock, media frenzy, and the inevitable social media speculation. Plans were put in place for managing statements, correcting inaccuracies, and framing public perception. Advisors were briefed, press contacts prepared, and internal communication channels established to ensure consistency. The aim was to dominate the story from every angle, leaving Harry and Meghan with little room to maneuver. Historical precedent also informed the palace's strategy. In previous scandals involving lineage, legitimacy, or family disputes, timing and control had been paramount. The royal family had learned that the most effective way to preserve authority was not to react hastily, but to release verified, irrefutable evidence in a way that maximized impact while minimizing opportunities for challenge. This approach, refined over centuries, combined patience, precision, and psychological insight. Tools the palace would now deploy with surgical accuracy. Meanwhile, the public remained largely unaware of the strategy unfolding behind the scenes. From the outside, it seemed as though news of DNA evidence might emerge spontaneously or be leaked accidentally. In reality, every element was orchestrated. Leaks were planted, documents prepared, and timing calculated to deliver maximum shock. It was a reminder that in the world of royalty, appearances are never accidental, and events that seem coincidental are often the product of long-term planning. The emotional stakes for Harry and Meghan escalated with each passing day. They were aware that something was coming, but they did not know the exact nature of the revelation, the timing, or the method of disclosure. The anticipation alone created psychological pressure, making it increasingly difficult to focus on public duties, family life, or even private relationships. Every photograph, every interview, and every public appearance became a reminder that the palace held a card they had yet to play, a card that could redefine everything. As the world prepared to consume the impending revelation, insiders hinted at the broader implications. This was not simply about personal family dynamics. It was about legacy, authority, and control. By releasing the DNA evidence, the palace was asserting dominance over the narrative, reinforcing the monarchy's authority, and signaling that even the most powerful individuals within the family were subject to institutional oversight. It was a strategic masterstroke, a move calculated to both protect and assert. And yet, the human element could not be ignored. Harry and Meghan, despite their intelligence, preparation, and resilience, were about to face a moment of profound shock. The children they loved, the family narrative they had cultivated, and the public image they had carefully managed were all at risk of being reframed in an instant. The palace's strategy was designed not only to reveal truth, but to amplify its impact, ensuring that the emotional, psychological, and public stakes were as high as possible. The stage was set. Every detail had been meticulously arranged, every potential response anticipated, and the moment of revelation, once triggered, would be immediate, undeniable, and irreversible. Harry and Meghan, despite their fame, influence, and foresight, would be confronted with facts that could not be disputed, denied, or spun. The carefully crafted illusion of family control, of personal authority, and of narrative mastery would face its ultimate test. When the news finally broke, the world reacted as though it had been struck by lightning. Headlines exploded across continents. Digital news outlets updated in real time. 24-hour cable channels interrupted programming, and social media erupted with speculation, outrage, and disbelief. Every platform, from Twitter to TikTok, was filled with debates, memes, and heated arguments. The revelation about Archie and Lilibet's DNA had crossed the line from rumor into undeniable fact, and the impact was immediate, widespread, and unprecedented. For millions of royal watchers, the moment was surreal. Could it be true? Could a truth so explosive really exist in the modern royal family? The idea that DNA evidence had upended what everyone assumed about Harry and Meghan's children challenged not just personal perception, but the very narrative of a family that had been under the world's microscope for years. Analysts scrambled to provide context. Historians weighed in on precedent. Psychologists discussed the emotional consequences. Social media users debated endlessly, drawing comparisons, speculating on motives, and predicting fallout. The news became an obsession. Television anchors and online commentators dissected every angle. Was this a scandal or a revelation? Did it affect succession? Did it challenge the monarchy's credibility? Or was it a personal matter cleverly orchestrated to dominate headlines? Each pundit added layers of interpretation, often contradicting one another, heightening the sense of chaos. It was the perfect storm for global media. A story combining royalty, secrecy, science, and family drama, all wrapped in a narrative that the world thought it understood, only to have that understanding shattered. Social media, in particular, became a lightning rod for reaction. Tweets questioning Harry and Meghan's decisions went viral, while memes mocking palace secrecy flooded timelines. Hashtags surged and trended internationally, each one reflecting the confusion, humor, or outrage of millions. Discussions ranged from the serious, ethical debates about privacy and parental rights, to the absurd, as users speculated wildly about the identity of the children's biological parents. The combination of mystery, science, and royal intrigue created a perfect viral storm. International media outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it for local audiences in ways that reflected their own perspectives on monarchy, celebrity, and family dynamics. In Europe, debates centered on tradition and legitimacy. In the United States, conversations highlighted personal freedom, public scrutiny, and systemic inequity. In Asia, the focus was on legacy and societal perception. The story transcended borders, languages, and cultures, becoming a global phenomenon. And yet, the most intense reactions were not public, they were private. Within royal circles, the news sent shockwaves. Senior royals, advisors, and staff members scrambled to understand the implications, coordinate messaging, and prepare for questions from both the public and press. Strategic meetings were convened, talking points drafted, and potential scenarios rehearsed. Every official knew that the fallout would be relentless, and that any misstep could have long-lasting consequences for the family's image, influence, and authority. For Harry and Meghan, the public reaction was almost overwhelming. They had long anticipated scrutiny and criticism, but nothing could have prepared them for the scale, speed, and intensity of this response. Social media, traditional news outlets, and private conversations converged into a single, unrelenting wave of attention. The couple found themselves responding not only to factual questions but to moral, ethical, and emotional judgments about their family, parenting, and integrity. Every decision they had made now came under renewed analysis, often unfairly or inaccurately. Public sentiment was polarized. Some supporters rallied behind the Sussexes, defending their right to privacy and their role as parents. Others expressed outrage, interpreting the revelation as a breach of trust, a manipulation of the narrative, or even a challenge to the monarchy itself. The speed at which opinions formed, spread, and evolved created a constantly shifting landscape, making it difficult for anyone, including Harry and Meghan, to anticipate consequences or manage responses effectively. The media also focused heavily on timing. Analysts pointed out that the release coincided with multiple high-profile events, ongoing political news, social movements, and celebrity scandals. This added to the complexity of the narrative. The palace, intentionally or not, had ensured maximum visibility for the revelation, creating a situation in which public attention could not be diverted. Harry and Meghan were now at the center of a story that dominated global discourse. Online communities exploded with speculation about the implications. What did the revelation mean for the children's public roles? For succession? For the legacy of Diana, Charles, and the wider royal family? How would the monarchy reconcile tradition with modern realities? The discussions were heated, emotional, and often contradictory, reflecting the global fascination with royal intrigue and the deep human interest in family secrets. Even friends, acquaintances, and extended networks of the Sussexes were forced into commentary. Individuals close to the family, previously silent or discreet, began offering opinions, clarifying facts, or strategically positioning themselves. Leaks, whether intentional or accidental, proliferated, further intensifying scrutiny. The combination of personal loyalty, institutional allegiance, and media opportunism created a pressure cooker environment that magnified the emotional stakes for all involved. Harry and Meghan's response, or lack thereof, became its own story. In public, they remained measured, polite, and cautious, but privately, the tension was palpable. Advisors documented every reaction, every statement, and every interaction to anticipate potential fallout. The couple found themselves navigating a world where their children's identities had become a global headline, where perception often overpowered reality, and where every move was scrutinized in real time. The global reaction was not just about scandal. It was about identity, trust, and narrative control. Millions were forced to reconsider what they believed about the family and about the very institution of the monarchy. Analysts compared the situation to historical crises, but few could match the modern complexity. Instantaneous global communication, social media amplification, and a public that expected transparency, accountability, and drama all at once. And yet, the most dramatic consequences were yet to come. The DNA proof itself, while publicized, had not yet been fully dissected, interpreted, or analyzed in detail. The palace had strategically timed the release to maximize impact, but the subtleties, implications, and emotional reverberations had barely begun to unfold. For Harry and Meghan, The initial shock of public reaction was only the beginning. Private questions, legal considerations, and family tensions were still building behind the scenes. The world watched, debated, and reacted. But inside Montecito, Harry and Meghan felt something far more immediate: disbelief, vulnerability, and a dawning realization that the story had just shifted irreversibly. What had been whispers behind palace walls was now an undeniable reality, and the full consequences were still unfolding. The walls of the palace have ears, or so the old saying goes. And in the wake of the DNA revelation, those walls suddenly seemed alive with stories long hidden. Memories once whispered behind closed doors now surfacing to shed light on the mystery surrounding Archie and Lilibet. Former staff members, previously bound by loyalty or fear, began to speak. Carefully at first, through anonymous channels, then more openly as journalists and documentarians sought their accounts. Their testimonies provided a rare window into a world the public rarely sees. A world of protocol, secrecy, and a constant balancing act between personal loyalty and institutional allegiance. For years, palace staff have operated under strict confidentiality agreements. Every conversation, every observation, every minor incident is meticulously documented and often relayed up the chain of command. In normal circumstances, these observations remain private, forming part of the intricate tapestry of palace operations. But in this case, the revelations about Archie and Lilibet were so significant that staff members felt compelled to share their perspectives. What they revealed was not scandalous in the sensational sense. It was profoundly human, revealing the pressures, fears, and loyalties that shaped the lives of those who lived closest to the Sussexes. One former nanny, speaking under anonymity, described the constant tension around the children's public appearances. Photographs were never casual. Every angle, every gesture, every expression was analyzed for potential implications. Even seemingly innocuous moments, Archie reaching for a toy, Lilibet laughing, were subject to scrutiny and, occasionally, correction. The nanny admitted that the focus on appearances sometimes overshadowed the children's everyday experiences, creating an environment where normal childhood spontaneity was often curtailed for the sake of optics. Other staff members emphasized the emotional strain on Harry and Meghan. While the public saw smiles, warmth, and familial affection, insiders observed a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Conversations about security, media exposure, and public perception were unrelenting. Harry and Meghan were reportedly vigilant, protective, and highly strategic, aware that any misstep could be magnified beyond comprehension. But staff also noted moments of exhaustion and frustration. The couple, despite their poise, were human, grappling with pressures few could imagine. Former security personnel added another dimension to the story. They confirmed that the palace maintained extraordinary levels of surveillance and oversight. Every visit, engagement, and personal interaction was logged. Even after moving to California, Harry and Meghan remained subject to intense observation, with information relayed back to London. While the family was not constantly monitored in a literal sense, the network of intelligence, reporting, and discreet oversight was comprehensive, ensuring the palace remained informed about both public and private developments. Perhaps most revealing were the accounts from those closest to the children. Former nannies, caregivers, and household staff described a pattern of meticulous management around Archie and Lilibet's routines. Birthdays, first steps, even the timing of naps were coordinated to minimize exposure, maximize public perception, and maintain control over narrative. The children were described as joyful, curious, and affectionate, yet their experiences were often framed through a lens of strategic image management. Staff recounted instances where minor deviations from expected behavior were corrected, not harshly, but with an awareness of how any action might be perceived or recorded. Insiders also shed light on the origins of the DNA rumors. Whispers had circulated within palace corridors for years, initially dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. Yet over time, with careful observation and collection of information, these whispers began to gain credibility. Staff members noted that discussions of lineage and parentage were never meant for public ears, but were part of long-standing traditions within the royal household, where genealogy,